Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. What I want to show you today is something a little unusual, something far brighter than I normally paint. There is a new game come out recently called Space Station Zero from the team over at Tabletop Minions, so Uncle Adam's had a hand in that as well as Vince, and it is brilliant. Now the artwork in there is astonishing. It's really looking at sci-fi through the lens of something a little more real world. If you were to imagine, what if Alien, that workaday, real-life science fiction were made today? And that's where the sort of cyberpunk look really turned in for me. Now, when I was a younger man, cyberpunk meant trench coats and black shades and all that sort of thing, whereas nowadays it's a lot brighter, and I prefer this kind of look. So inspired by the artwork in Space Station Zero, I'm going to show you how I've painted this fella here, and I had a blast. So all of the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. Now once he's been assembled and cleaned up, I've given him a primer spray of Wraithbone. You could just as easily use white, whether it be Citadel's white or the army paint or anything of the like, as long as it's something nice and smooth, because we are going to use mostly contrast here. What we'll start with is Black Legion, and this is one of the new contrast line. I've always quite liked Black Templar, but Black Legion almost feels more like a traditional black paint. Like, just look how that covers. I know that I'm gushing over contrast here, and you could just use black paint, but this is really nice. So I'm going to cover over his SMGs first of all, and then we'll add a little bit of this to the armor plating on his chest and on his shins. Now, generally speaking with contrast, you want to start from either the lowest areas or places that are going to be difficult to reach later on. Because if we make any mistakes here, we splurge over the base coat where we don't want this, it's easier to tidy up at this stage than it will be to try and paint this in later around any reds or yellows or what have you that we've already painted. And once that's dried, it's time to think about other areas that are going to be difficult to reach. So that's going to be his face mask to start with. What I've got here is roughly half and half Telesar blue and contrast medium. Strictly speaking, you don't need to thin this out, but I just wanted a slightly less saturated finish over the mask. We'll get a little bit of that Wraithbone still showing through. So take your time. If you want to, you can try avoiding his eyes. That might look cool later on. Yeah, now that's given me an idea. Once that's dried, we've got a nice rich blue, but I have made a couple of little mistakes off to the sides there. And this is why I mentioned doing the hard to reach parts first. What I've got is a little bit of Wraithbone from the pot, and I'm going to just paint over those areas that I do need to tidy up before applying the next coat. So anywhere that I mention, do your tidy up, this is what I mean, just a tiny wee bit of Wraithbone. You may need to apply it in 2 coats over certain things. And once it has dried, I'm going to paint his scarf in. Now I know I'm going to make a mess of this, so I've got that Wraithbone on standby. What I have is Volupus Pink. I think around his neck what I want is something like a warm color, and I don't just want to go straight to a red or an orange. So something nice and rich. Volupus Pink is going to be the winner here. Now I managed that without making a dreadful mess. I'm quite impressed with myself. What we're going to flip him around and do now is to paint in his backpack. Now the way his pack is attached to his back, it looks like it's a couple of different colors. So I am going to use here, first of all, Agaros Dunes to paint in the main body of it. Just avoiding the straps themselves in the process. And making a mess of the straps themselves. Oh goodness. Now after going over all of the straps, I did decide eventually just to paint in the whole pack with that Agaros Dunes. What's more cyberpunk than a sensible backpack? We're going to move on to the trousers, and I've got here another of the new colors. This is Garagax Sewer, and it is wonderful. Such a nice brown. I'm going to try and avoid these panels and straps on the trousers, because I've got plans for them later. Now that brown dries to a very nice warm sort of tint, and it's a lot less dark and chalky than I find Wildwood can go in its place. Real favorite of mine, that one. Now what I'm going to do is try and frame. We've got the top part of the miniature there with a warm bandana around his neck. So what I'm going to use for his boots might be a bit of a surprise. I'm going to go to Flesh Tearer's Red. Red boots are just cool, come on. And they're certainly going to look striking. I'm using this rather than Blood Angel's Red because Flesh Tearer's Red, it's got a real grungy, almost brown tint at the base of it, so it's going to work quite well. Now those aren't quite dry yet, but man, that red's funky. I really like Flesh Tearer's Red. We're going to move on to Gore Grunter Fur, and what I'm going to use this for is most of the leather details. So stuff like his pouches across his chest, a little bit of this. Gore Grunter Fur is a nice warm reddish leather, and it's going to work well with the tone that we're developing for this guy overall. And there's a spot I'm going to have to tidy up. Now the patches that are on his knees and up on his shoulders, if I spin them around here you'll see those, I'm going to use here Griffhound Orange. And carefully approach the edges, because I don't want to get this on his jacket, if I can avoid it. Now to my eyes, that still looks just a little too orderly. Doesn't look like enough of a fashion disaster yet. So what I've got is Plague Bearer Flesh. You could use a different green or even a blue here. What I'm going to do is just paint in the cuffs of his jacket here. Now that's a funny one, because it will look absolutely vile going on, but once it's dried, actually, it's not too bad. Now is where we're going to go beyond the realm of good sense and decorum. And I have Iand in yellow, we're going to paint in all of his jacket with this. So, as with most contrast things, best thing to do is tackle an area at a time. Don't just splurge it on and try and do the whole thing. You want a fair bit of control over his hood and arm at a time and so forth. This is going to look real, almost orange going on, but as it dries, it'll look a little more, well, I was about to say reasonable. It will not look reasonable, it will look ridiculous, but that's what we want. Boy, oh boy, is that bright. But I really like that finish. You're going to want to apply a little more on the sleeves than you might think. And when you're applying it, you can sort of wiggle it into place to get some of the deeper recesses shaded. It's a lot of fun. What I've got here is Fire Slayer Flesh, and this is the last of the contrast colors we're going to apply. This stretch here on his arm, there's a little seam here, which looks like it could be a cable or maybe part of an undersuit or what have you. I'm going to paint on a skin tone, mostly because I want to add just a little to imply that there is someone human under all of this. And then for the clearly inhuman, we're going to use Iron Hand Steel. And this is going to go over quite a few things. He's got his robotic arm up the side here, but also the little grenades and what have you on his chest. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time fussing around making these individual different colors, so a bit of silver over these will do the job. Now, as well as his arm and a couple of those little details, I've done in the zippers with a little bit of the silver, painted in his eyes with it too. I'm not sure what I want to stick to there, and a little bit just in that vein in his arm. I figured that makes it look a little more like he's been upgraded somehow. What I've got now is some Necron compound, and we're going to do this before we shade that metal, because we're going to very lightly dry brush the guns. You do not need very much of this at all, just lightly flicking along the edges to pick out some of the surface detail and make that black look a little more interesting. Once that's had a chance to dry and settle, we're going to shade all of that, including the black stuff that we've just painted. So what I've got here is Agrax Earthshade, and it's not going to matter too much if it's the old or the new. I've got the old stuff here, but it's goop as goop as goop, you know. So paint this over the guns, little silver details. You could use Nuln Oil here if you preferred, but I kind of like the idea that our guy, does he look like the sort of chap who's necessarily got enough credits, I guess, to keep his gear in tip-top condition? Who knows? That'll make your silver just a little more interesting to look at. And from here, honestly, we could varnish him and call him done. But I do want to show you something that somebody suggested to me not too long ago, and I want to give it a shot. So I'm going to experiment on camera, and we'll see if it works. So what I've got here on my palette is a little dot of Vallejo ivory. Now here you could use pallid witch flesh, you could even use Wraithbone, or you might want to stick to a white instead. Experiment with this like I am. What I'm doing is loading up my brush with just a dollop of, this is Iandan yellow, and I'm going to put it off to the side of my palette here. And then with just what's in my brush, mix it in, we'll mix that together. So we're looking roughly a 1-to-1 mix for the contrast color we want to highlight and an ivory sort of color. It doesn't look too bad. And now what we'll do is pick a couple of areas that we want to highlight. So along the edges of the front of his jacket is probably a good contender here. Let's try this. And, okay. It's not massively sharp. If I were to add just a couple of lines of this, with maybe a little bit more of that white, I think that would look quite cool. I don't want to go nuts with it. I don't really want to completely change up the finish that I've got here, but just using a little of this to sharpen some of those edges. Yeah, man, mixing the contrast into a white, that's going to do the job. That's quite cool. I did say at first I wasn't going to do very much of that, but the more of it I started putting on, man, that works so well. Sometimes people on the internet just have really good ideas and then they share them with people. That's brilliant. So I'm going to try it with the blue as well. I've got here some Talisar blue and I've mixed this into a proper white. This isn't into ivory, and I also haven't used any of the contrast medium. Let's try, let's get up into the corner of this panel here and just do a little bit of edge highlighting. Oh man, this is the business. Why didn't I think of this earlier? This is great. I can't believe this didn't occur to me earlier. Like, they're just really pigmented washes, so if you apply them to white, you're going to get a mix. That's brilliant. Here's Volupus Pink with a little bit of white. I've also done that to the orange and to the leather. I think it's going to work better on some colors than others. You are going to end up with a slightly pastel finish, and I would recommend having a play around with the saturation. Add a little bit more contrast as you like. But what I'm going to do now is just to dry brush the backpack, because I think trying to painstakingly highlight this is going to drive me mad. So I've got some Terminatus Stone, one of my little makeup brushes. I'll just add a bit of visual interest here. All right, just one more color. What I've got, this is Vallejo's Air Chrome, and this is so bright. What I'm going to do is get just a tiny wee bit of this onto my brush, and I'm going to use it to paint little jagged blips and scratches onto the metallic stuff, that black that we painted earlier. I don't want to try highlighting this with a pastel grey. I don't think that'll quite do the job. A little bit of scuffing, just a regular dip, dip, dip at the edges will give this a bit of interest and make it look cool. And once I've done this, what I'm going to do is take him outside, hit him with a matte varnish, and I'm not going to put a terribly complex base on this guy. Space Station Zero, I kind of want just a simple black base for gaming, so I'm just going to paint it in black and make sure to hit that with the varnish as well. And there at last, our Space Station Zero themed cyberpunk trooper, warrior, runner, whatever you're going to call him, is complete. So today's discovery really is being able to mix in a little bit of white to those contrast paints to get an easy highlight. Like I said, it is going to work better with some colors than others, but I think when you really want to push the boundaries of good taste, really bright pastel highlights is going to work quite well. I'm really pleased with how this dude's turned out. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Andrew, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free, drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.